Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
I want you to imagine a table where the roles are so fixed that no one notices them anymore, where one person is the star with a ready spotlight and the rest of us are stagehands with napkins and polite smiles, because that was Easter lunch at my parents' house. And when my dad cleared his throat and raised his glass to my sister's bright future, listing her internships and her new apartment, and the fact that her boss uses words like initiative and leadership when he emails her, there was a moment when the room tightened like a belt after a heavy meal, not because anyone felt guilty or confused, but because the script was being delivered exactly as written and everyone knew their cues except me, who was supposed to laugh, nod, and refill glasses. I did what I always do, which is the thing that looks like respect but is really self-protection. And I gathered the dishes while they were still warm, and I said things like, "Let me get that," and "Do you want more?" And I kept my face steady because if I let my expression change even a little, it would have turned into a family story about how I can never let a nice moment pass without bringing down the mood, which is what happens every time I ask for a little balance. So I made myself small and useful, and it is funny how easy that is when you have practiced it for years and can do it without thinking. My sister, whose name is Hannah, reached for my mother's hand while the toast was still hanging in the air like steam, and she smiled in that way that says, "Can you believe I am this blessed?" And my mother squeezed back and said, "You deserve everything that is coming, sweetheart." And the way she said everything had a weight to it that did not include me, because in our house love is not a circle, it is a beam that swings toward the person who makes the best story at the moment, and lately the story has been Hannah's career and Hannah's apartment and Hannah's friends who take weekend trips and post photos with long captions about growth, while I am the person who shows up, pays attention, and somehow ends up invisible. I know how that sounds, and I am not interested in pity or in rewriting history to make myself look like a saint, because I have my pride and my stubbornness and my mouth, and I have made mistakes that landed loudly. Yet there is a difference between being imperfect and being erased, and I felt the erasing happen again as my dad topped off my sister's glass and said to many more firsts, "Kiddo," and he did not even look in my direction, not once. And it hit me in a way I could not swallow, not because I needed a ribbon or a speech, but because no one bothered to say my name out loud in my parents' house on a day that was supposed to be about grace and new starts. So I moved plates to the sink and ran the water and told myself to get through the afternoon, and you would think a person would blow up in that moment, say something wild, make a scene and break the pattern, but here is the truth that took me years to learn. Explosions give them a new story where you are the unreasonable one, while silence gives you space to choose your timing, and timing is everything when the only power you have left is control of the next beat. While I scraped the plates, I mentally counted the small pieces of leverage I had allowed to exist for far too long. The shared family group where I am the only one who answers practical questions. The monthly charges I cover because it is easier to keep the peace than to hear my mother sigh about how things are tight right now. The favors I have done for Hannah that she never mentions out loud because it would interrupt the image of effortlessness she has built. And I realized that my mistake has never been being unworthy, it has been being convenient, and convenience is a trap that looks like love until you stop providing it. When dessert came out, I took the first slice to my dad and the second to my mother, and offered my sister the biggest piece, because that is what I do, and she laughed and said, "You know me, I can always make room for more." And everyone laughed with her as if this were charming and not a pattern, and I decided in that exact second that I would not argue anymore. I would not ask to be seen. I would not offer a resume of all the quiet things I do, because a person cannot hear you when you are explaining your worth inside a room that refuses to value it, so I would let the room keep its story while I wrote a different ending in a place they could not control. After coffee, my mother pressed leftovers into my hands like peace offerings, and she told me to take the good container and bring it back next week, and I said of course, and I kissed her cheek because I still love her and I always will. But love does not mean volunteering to be the carpet, and on the way to the door my dad clapped my shoulder and told me to drive safe, as if that were the only thing he had to say to me, and I smiled the kind of smile that turns into resolve when no one is looking, because I knew something they did not know, which is that I was done acting the part they kept handing me. When I got home, I stacked the containers in the fridge and sat at the table and took a breath that did not belong to anyone else, and I opened my laptop and looked at the autopays and the subscriptions and the family calendar events I manage without credit. And I thought about how often I say yes before anyone even asks, and how they have learned to step over the yes without noticing, and I realized that the most generous thing I could do for myself was to stop making it effortless for them. To pretend I am not there, because effortlessness is the reason they forget me. I did not rage, I did not write a long message, I did not threaten or beg, I just began moving my weight from places where it props up people who do not see me to places where it would matter to me, and I felt a calm I have never felt in that house. The kind of calm that is not about revenge for the sake of hurting, but about giving people the gift of living with the consequences of their stories, which sounds colder than I am, but it is not cold. It is honest. By the time I turned off the kitchen light, I had made a decision that did not need anyone's permission, and it sat in my chest like a key I had finally found after years of patting down the wrong pockets. And I promised myself that Easter would not end the way they imagined it would end, because I am finished being the background, and I am finished waiting to be named. And if they want a toast to a bright future, they can have one, but it will not be the one they expect. And it will not be about my sister alone. When I woke up the next morning, there was that familiar reflex to slide right back into the unpaid role I have held for years without ever getting hired for it, the one where I smooth the edges of everyone else's day before mine even begins. And I stood in my kitchen with coffee going cold and thought about how easily I have been trained to do small rescues that no one calls rescues, so that by the time I arrive at any family moment, I am already tired and they are already comfortable, and I decided that if I wanted a different ending, I would have to change the part that never gets seen, which is the list of things I take care of before anyone knows there was something to take care of. I opened my laptop like it was a door to a messy closet that I have been shoving things into for years and clicked into the utilities accounts, the grocery delivery, the family phone plan I had added my parents to when their old phones stopped working, the streaming logins that Hannah uses but never mentions because acknowledging it would cut into the narrative of how effortlessly she manages her life, and I looked at the autopays lined up in neat rows under my name like loyal employees that never sleep. And I realized that nothing about my parents' easier days is accidental. It has my fingerprints on it, and I sat there long enough for the coffee to turn from warm to nothing, and I started to take my hands off the wheel piece by piece. I will tell you exactly what I did because the details matter when you want to understand why the ground shifts, not with drama, but with the quiet click of a lock that was finally turned the other way. I paused autopay on the electric and gas at the end of the billing cycle so there would be no surprise shutoff. I removed my card from the grocery delivery account and set the account to require a new payment method before the next order could go through. I sent a polite message to customer support on the phone plan explaining that my parents would be moving to their own billing but could keep the same numbers, and I scheduled the change for the day after the current period ended so no one could say I left them scrambling. Because this is not about punishment, it is about refusing to fund my own erasure, and there is a difference. Then I opened the shared family calendar, the one that magically updates with reminders about my dad's doctor appointments and my mother's prescriptions and my sister's cannot miss work events that somehow always land on weekends when I was originally supposed to visit, and I scrolled through the color-coded blocks that I had created and maintained and confirmed and rescheduled and apologized for when other people forgot them. And I removed myself as organizer and added my parents' emails as owners, and I sent each of them a short note that sounded like the kind of practical, non-emotional help they prefer to receive, because I have learned that if you package a boundary as a useful instruction manual, it is harder for them to argue with it. So I wrote that going forward they now have direct control over their appointments and can update times as needed, and I included the login steps they always ask me to repeat, and I closed the tab before I could second-guess myself into old habits. I thought about Hannah with her shiny new stories and how I have been part of the production crew for those stories too, not because she asked in a way that felt like a demand, but because she asked in that breezy way that suggests you are simply the kind of person who makes things easier for others, and if you are not careful you start believing that this is your best quality, which is a dangerous thing for a grown woman to believe. So I opened the email where her landlord had once looped me. in as the emergency contact after an awkward late rent situation that I quietly fixed when she was traveling, and I wrote back to the office in clear, friendly language that I should not be listed as a financial or emergency contact for a tenant who is fully capable, and I gave them Hannah's phone and my parents' number, and I removed myself from the triangle I never agreed to live inside. There was a part of me that wanted to blast a speech in the group chat, the one with aunts and cousins and holiday plans and a lot of photos of pies, and make a declaration about respect and being thanked. But the wiser part of me knows that speeches are for people who want to be persuaded, and my family loves a speech only when it is about Hannah's brightness, so instead I updated a single calendar event that had me down as the person coordinating dessert for a fundraiser brunch my parents host at their church, and I reassigned the task to the person who toasted to bright futures without looking at me, and the system sent automatic notifications with my little note attached saying I will not be available to coordinate this year. Please reach out to Hannah. She is terrific at planning, which is both true and, in this case, very useful. You may think this is small, that this is me unplugging cords and moving names in software and nothing more, yet if you have ever been the person who holds quiet systems together, you know that these are the bones of a family's routine. And when the bones are no longer supported by the person you take for granted, you start to feel the weight that was there all along, and it is not cruel to let people feel that weight. It is honest, and it is overdue. I did one last thing because petty is not the word, but precision is, and precision matters when you are teaching people to recognize your value. I redeemed the grocery delivery rewards points that had accumulated under my account from years of orders for my parents' house and for Hannah when she was moving and totally swamped. And I used those points to buy my own pantry staples and a few things I never add because I am always saving for someone else, and I cooked myself dinner that night without apologizing to an empty room, and I felt my spine straighten the way it does when you carry your own weight on purpose and set down what is not yours. By late evening, I had 2 red receipts on the calendar notifications and 1 reply from my dad that said let us talk later and 1 empty space where my mother's usual thank you would have appeared because she sends thank yous for pies and borrowed vases, but not for labor she refuses to notice, and I did not chase her or soften the edges or add a follow-up text with a heart because I am done cushioning people from reality, and I set my phone face down on the table like I used to set down car keys after a long drive, and I listened to the quiet and thought, this is the sound of boundaries living in the house where I grew up, and it is not a threat, it is a fact. When I finally turned off the lights, I did one more tiny, necessary thing that I knew would land with the kind of thud you hear in your stomach before you hear it in your ears, and I admit I smiled when I did it. Because revenge can be clean and it can be fair, and it can be a simple click that says as of now you will need your own card to order groceries for the week, and with that I shut the laptop, put my phone on Do Not Disturb, and walked away from the role they counted on me to play, knowing that the morning would send the first wave of confused texts and that, for once, I would not be the person who fixes confusion before anyone else ever has to feel it. The morning after I pulled my hands off the levers everyone pretended did not exist, the small tremors started exactly where I knew they would start, with the grocery delivery that did not process, because there was no card on file. With my mother sending a string of texts that began friendly and slid into confused, and then landed on that sharp tone she saves for me when I stop making things easy, and I answered once, calmly and without apology, reminding her that I had sent clear instructions and logins the day before, that she now had control of her orders and could use any card she preferred. And I left it there because if I allowed the conversation to turn into a courtroom, I would end up arguing for my right to stop paying for people who do not see me, which is not a debate I am willing to have anymore. By midday the next thread unraveled, not with a blow-up or a fight, but with something much simpler and more honest, which was silence at the exact moment when someone else should have spoken. Because the church fundraiser brunch committee had a reminder go out and the dessert coordinator tag now sat under my dad's name, and as the replies rolled in with questions about pickup times and portion sizes and budget, there was no quick answer because the person who usually answers had removed herself from that job, and when one of the older women from church called me out of habit, I told her plainly that I had stepped back and that my dad was in charge this year. And she paused long enough to understand that the habit of relying on me was not the same thing as an agreement that I would always be there, and she thanked me in the slow, careful way people thank someone who finally tells the truth. My sister tried to keep the tone light, sending a message about how she could bake something if needed, which was funny because she does not bake and does not plan to, but she wanted the optics of being helpful, and when no one replied with instant gratitude, she pinged me privately with a little act of performance, asking if I could just jump on a quick call and handle the dessert plan because Dad seemed busy and Mom was stressed, and it would be a big help just this once, and I looked at that phrasing just this once and thought about how often those 3 words have covered a lifetime of unpaid work. So I wrote back that the committee has all the contacts and that Dad has the budget sheet. And I put my phone down again because I am no longer auditioning for the role of family assistant. By late afternoon, the landlord's office that had once looped me into my sister's emergencies finally reached her instead, and I know that because she called me in a rush to ask what on earth I had told them, and I told her the truth. That I told them she is a competent adult and that any financial issues or apartment problems should go to her or our parents, and she laughed that brittle little laugh she uses when she feels cornered and said this is so dramatic, and I said there is nothing dramatic about handing people their own responsibilities, and she tried to pivot into that tired line about how family helps family, and I told her I agree, which is why she is going to get a chance to help herself. In the early evening, when the committee finally realized no one had confirmed dessert quantities, the nice woman who handles table assignments sent a group email to loop me back in, and I watched my name appear on a thread I had just left the day before. And instead of replying with a long explanation that would make me sound defensive, I forwarded the entire thread to the treasurer with a short, direct note, reminding her that for the last several years many of the dessert purchases and paper goods for the event had been charged to my personal card without reimbursement because I did not ask for it and because my parents liked things to look seamless, and that I would appreciate having the receipts from those years recorded under my name for donor recognition purposes or reimbursed to me from the brunch fund if that is how they now prefer to handle it, and that going forward the budget and procurement should go through the coordinator listed on the calendar, which is my dad, and that I would not be available to manage or sponsor this year. The treasurer, who is practical and not sentimental, replied all because she always replies all, and she wrote that she had reviewed the records and found multiple years where dessert and supplies were indeed covered by me. And she thanked me by name for those contributions and asked my dad to confirm this year's budget by the morning. And then she asked the committee to update the program to include my name in the donor list where it had previously been anonymous under the general family heading, and the way that message landed was so quiet and so perfect that I do not think I could have planned it better, because it did not accuse anyone of anything, it simply shined a light on facts that had been kept in the dark for convenience. My mother called 3 times within 10 minutes and left a voicemail about how this was not necessary and how I was making her look ungrateful. And I listened once and deleted it because I am done performing gratitude for people who only recognize gratitude when it is turned toward them. And when my dad finally texted that we should talk tonight, I wrote back that I would be available tomorrow afternoon for a short call and that if he needed help confirming quantities, he could use the template I had sent last year and that it was saved in the shared drive under events, and I swear to you I could feel the house I grew up in tilting 1 degree, because the person who usually throws herself under the cart had stepped aside and let the cart keep rolling. There was one more piece I wanted to place, not out of spite but out of accuracy, because accuracy is the one thing favoritism cannot argue with. So I emailed the church office and asked that any public thank yous related to past brunches list individual donors rather than family names, and I attached scans of my receipts from the last few years. And the office manager replied so quickly with a thank you that I knew she too had always suspected the credit was not being assigned correctly, and in that moment I felt something unclench in me that I had been holding since I was a teenager, when I first learned that in our house the person who did the work was rarely the person named. By night, the committee had reissued the dessert plan with my dad's name at the top and a line at the bottom that thanked me for prior years of generosity, and I did not screenshot it, or send it to anyone or look for congratulations. I simply let it exist in the world where it belonged, and I slept better than I have in a long time, not because I won anything, but because I stopped surrendering to a story that kept me invisible, and as I closed my eyes I knew they thought this was the end of my little rebellion, when in reality it was only the first crack that would make the rest impossible to ignore. By the time my dad finally caught me on the phone the next afternoon, he came in with that careful tone he saves for situations he thinks can be massaged back to normal with a little charm and a promise to revisit things later. And I let him do the opening routine because I wanted to hear exactly how the old playbook sounded when the stagehands were gone, and sure enough he started with how my mother was overwhelmed and how everything had piled up at once and how I should have given them more warning before changing the accounts and the calendar and the committee pieces, and I listened without interrupting until he ran out of air, because I have learned that when people are used to being carried, they mistake the ground for an attack. And when he finally asked what I needed in order to put things back the way they were, I said very calmly that what I needed was for them to live with the way things are now and to stop acting like I stole something from them when all I did was return what was never mine to hold, and then I told him there were 2 more changes coming and that he might want to write them down. The first change was simple and, for me, merciful, because it closed a door I never should have opened in the first place. And I explained that I had already transferred access for my mother's prescription notifications and clinic portal from my email to her phone and to his, and that the pharmacy would no longer call me for refills or approvals or appointment reminders, and that if they needed help setting up the password manager, I would walk them through it one time tomorrow and never again. And he started to say that my mother hates those systems and that I know how she gets, and I said I do know how she gets, which is why I have quietly managed her whole medical calendar for years, and that is precisely the problem. Because managing someone's life is a form of love only when the person acknowledges it and participates in it, and otherwise it turns you into staff, and I am not staff. The second change was the one that landed, not because it was cruel, but because it made the past visible. And I told him that I had sent an email to the church treasurer and the committee documenting the years of dessert and supplies that I had purchased personally, and that the office would be listing my name in the donor section going forward, and that I had attached receipts with totals, not to shame anyone but to correct the record, and he went quiet in a way that told me he had not thought through how many times he had accepted anonymous generosity under the family label because it felt easier than naming me specifically, and I said that ease is a luxury paid for by someone, and for many years it was paid for by me. And he took a long breath that sounded like the first honest thing he had done in days, and he said he would speak to my mother. I could have left it there, and if I were a different woman I might have, but there was one more piece that needed to move, because it was the backbone of the mythology that keeps this family humming. The one where my sister is a miracle of competence and I am the reliable pair of hands in the wings, so I took a deep breath and I sent one private email, not to the committee and not to the cousins and not to the group chat that loves a tidy narrative, but to my parents alone, and in it I included a single page, plain as a grocery list, with the line items of what I have covered or coordinated for the last few years, not just the utilities and the groceries and the phones and the calendar, but the late rent that one time when Hannah was between paychecks and traveling, and the short-term loan I gave them when the water heater died and they did not want to worry the relatives, and the surprise car repair that I put on my card because my dad said he would feel better paying me back in small chunks, which he did for a while and then stopped, and we never spoke of it again. And at the bottom of the page I wrote the total, not because I wanted an argument about money, but because money is a language even people who hate hard conversations understand. And I spelled it out so there would be no chance of skimming past it, a number that sits in the low tens of thousands, and I told them I did not want reimbursement, I wanted recognition, and I wanted it to stop. I hit send and immediately felt that sickening urge to follow it with a softening message, the reflex apology that women like me learn early and use often, the one that says, "Forget I said that, I was tired, I am fine." But I did not send it because I was not tired and I was not angry, I was clear, and clarity does not need padding, and I put my phone face down and waited for the wave to hit, which it did, not as a thunderclap but as a dozen small ripples. The church office sending a chirpy Confirmation that the program would reflect updated donors. The treasurer looping my dad to confirm this year's budget and noting, very neutrally, that a named donor had previously covered the gap most years. A cousin texting the group about how nice it would be to thank people by name at the brunch this time, and my mother calling and hanging up twice without leaving a message, because there are not many good words when the air has been cleared that much. Late afternoon turned into early evening, and I made dinner without checking my phone, and when I finally looked there was a message from my aunt who always notices more than she admits, a simple line that said I had no idea, followed by a heartless little thumbs up from a cousin who loves any sign of drama that is not about him, and I ignored them both because my audience for this was never the extended family. It was the two people who taught me how love is handed out in our house. And they were finally being asked to look at the ledger, not so they could pay me back, but so they could stop pretending there was nothing to see. When it got dark, I stepped outside to breathe air that did not feel like a debate, and my phone buzzed with a text from Hannah, the timing as predictable as a traffic light. A short message laced with the kind of panic she calls concern when she wants to make herself the responsible one, and it read that our mother was shaken and would not talk and did I do something. And I stood there with my thumb over the keyboard thinking about how to answer a question that is both too simple and too dishonest, because what I did was remove the curtain that made everything look magical when it was really manual, and I decided my response could wait, because for once it was not my job to settle anyone down. And I let the screen go dark while the house across town finally sat with the truth I had laid out in plain language. When Hannah's message lit up my phone with that clipped line about our mother being shaken and silent and did I do something, I stared at it long enough to feel the old muscle memory asking me to smooth, explain, and make it gentle. And I could almost hear the version of me from last year drafting a response that would wrap everything in calm, but I have learned that calm is not the same as truth, so I put the phone face down, finished what I was doing without rushing, and then called my parents to set a time later that day for a short conversation with an agenda, because if I have to be the adult, then I am going to be the kind who uses lists and clocks and refuses to drown in feelings that only show up when accountability walks in the room. When they answered together, my dad opened with the same careful tone and my mother stayed quiet in the background, and I said we were going to keep this simple and specific, and that there were 3 things that needed to happen, not for punishment, not for drama, but for accuracy and closure, and I could feel them bracing, so I spoke with the kind of even pace I use at work when projects are skidding and people want rescue more than responsibility, and the first thing I said was that every bill I had been handling now lives with the person who generates it, which means the phone plan is theirs, the utilities are theirs, the grocery account is theirs, and I will not be the backup card or the emergency contact or the default planner. Not because I do not love them, but because love has become the disguise for labor in this family, and I am done hiding work behind a softer word. The second thing was the ledger, and I told them that I do not want repayment and I do not want to fight about numbers. I want a record and I want it to stop. And to make sure it stops, I have already shifted the amount I have been quietly paying every month into an automatic transfer that goes into my own savings, labeled with a name that makes me smile when I look at it, which is simply Future with my name on it. And I do not need anyone's blessing to do that because the money was mine in the first place, and if my mother wanted to know why I did not discuss this in person before sending the email, the answer is that in person I get steamrolled by tears and guilt and historical footnotes that make every request for fairness sound like an attack. And email lets facts stand without being shouted over. The third thing was the brunch, which had become the neat little stage where the family myth gets rehearsed every spring, and I told my dad that because I will not let their mess hurt a community event that has nothing to do with our issues. I had already placed a dessert order with the same bakery I have used for years, matched to the exact quantities from the last successful brunch, and the bakery had his name and card on file because I called ahead yesterday and moved the account contact and payment method to him, which means the event will be fine even if no one lifts a finger until pickup, and he will sign for it and pay for it and talk to the committee like the listed coordinator that he now is. And he went silent in the way that says the first feeling is not gratitude but shock that someone else decided a plan without him, and I let the silence land because there are consequences to handing grown-up tasks back to grown-ups. And the consequence here is that the morning is going to require him to show up like I have been showing up for years. My mother finally spoke, and it came out as that tight little question she uses when she wants to make the moment about tone rather than substance, asking if I really needed to go as far as emailing receipts and asking the office to print names, and I said yes. I did, because accuracy is not cruelty and because I am done being the anonymous credit under a family heading that gets clapped for while I carry boxes out the side door, and she started to say that this would embarrass her, and I said that embarrassment is not the same as harm and that I have been living with the harm of invisibility for a long time, and I am allowed to choose visible facts over comfortable fiction. And then I told them I would not be arguing about this any further, because I have said what I mean, and I mean what I said, and we wrapped the call with the kind of awkward politeness that happens when the script is gone and no one knows their lines. Hannah called next because of course she did, and she came in hot with the words dramatic and unnecessary and could I please think about how this is affecting Mom, and I told her I had thought about how this affected Mom for years while I patted everything she walked on. And that I am thinking about it now by handing her back her keys and her passwords and her bills and her calendar, and then Hannah tried the old bait about family being family, and I said family is not a passcode to my wallet. Or my time, and then she pivoted into the text that triggered all of this, asking again what I had done to shake our mother, and I told her the truth in one line that did not invite a counterargument, that I had stopped disappearing and that when the person who disappears stops doing that, it can look like an earthquake to the people who enjoyed the view, and for once she had nothing to say. The brunch happened 2 days later because time does not stop just because people are uncomfortable, and I decided to attend because I am not hiding from my own choices, and because I wanted to see what the world looks like when I do not show up early with a trunk full of trays and a smile that says I am fine, and I walked in with friends I had invited weeks ago to support the event rather than to chaperone my feelings. And the program listed donors by name with my name right there, spelled the way it is on my checks and not tucked inside a family label, and the treasurer gave her usual practical remarks, and when the podium turned to my dad for the coordinator notes, he read the list the way he reads anything that makes him nervous. Steady and careful, and he said my name with the same mouth that had raised a glass to someone else's bright future and somehow forgotten mine, and in that simple, undeniable moment the story shifted, not with a speech, not with a fight, but with a printed line and a public thank you and a bill he had to pay like any other adult. After the event, my mother came up to me with eyes that were softer than they had been in days, and she said she had not understood the scale of what I had been doing. And I told her that not understanding is not the same as not knowing because I have been telling them in ways they did not want to hear, and she started to apologize and then tripped on the part where she wanted me to promise I would keep helping. And I said I will help like a daughter, not like staff, and that means sometimes yes and sometimes no, and it means I will not be the first call every time something small gets hard. And she nodded the way people nod when they finally realize the old system is not coming back. On the way out, my dad tried to lighten the air with a joke about how the bakery did a great job and how he now appreciates how much work goes into an event that looks easy, and I told him that is how a lot of my life has looked from his side of the table. And he put a hand on my shoulder like he did the day I left their house with leftovers and a decision, and he said he would do better, and I did not hand him a script or a checklist or a promise to remind him. I just said I hope so, because that is as far as my job goes now. That night, Hannah sent another text, shorter this time, not about Mom but about whether I was really going to keep everything the way it is, and I said yes, and she wrote back that it felt extreme. And I told her that extreme is what the middle looks like to someone who has lived at the center for too long, and I wished her good night without a smiley face or a softening line. And I put my phone on the counter and poured myself a glass of water like a person who has done the last thing she owed herself. If you want to know whether I regret anything, I do not, and if you want to know whether it worked, it did, because the balance in that house tilted back toward fairness in small, measurable ways that do not make great stories, but make a better life. And if you want the final answer to the question Hannah asked at the start, if I did something, here it is. I put my name on my work. I handed back what was never mine to carry. I stopped cushioning people from the weight of their own choices, and then I raised my own glass, not to anyone's bright future, but to the very ordinary, very hard, very necessary act of not disappearing anymore, which turns out to be the smartest revenge I could have planned, clean and final and exactly enough.